Hello, everyone. This week we are going to examine the circulatory system and we are going to continue to work with the fetal pig. The objectives of this week's lab is we are going to review the pathway of blood flow in the mammalian heart. And it's important that we understand how blood flow works in the adult because it's going to be a little bit different in how blood flow works in the fetus. All right, so the circulatory system, which is our main focus this week, is a system that involves both your heart and all the blood vessels. Mammals, we have a closed circulatory system, meaning that blood travels through distinct vessels. Within these vessels, the bloods are transporting nutrients, gases, waste products, and hormones as well. And it relies on your heart, which is a very strong muscle that is able to pump all these things throughout the rest of your body. Keep in mind, hormones, for instance, that are made in the brain has to travel all the way to faraway structure like the gonads. Now, it has to rely on the circulatory system because it's traveling through the distinct blood vessels. So the heart is a very important organ. In the fetus, though, the heart is functioning, but it's not functioning to the extent that the adult heart is functioning. And the main reason is that in the adult heart, the blood that's coming out of the aorta is fully oxygenated. In the fetus, there's a little bit of mixture of blood, so it's considered somewhat functioning, but it is still working to pump out that oxygen blood throughout the rest of the fetus body. Okay. All right, so when we take a look at the anatomy of the heart, in the mammalian heart, there are four chambers, and each chamber are completely separated from each other. Let's start with the right side first. The right side of the heart is includes the chambers that carry deoxygenated blood, so oxygen poor blood. You have the right atrium and the right ventricle. I think of the word atrium, it starts with the letter A. It comes before the letter V. So the right atrium is on top of the right ventricle chamber. On the left side of the heart, you have the left atrium and the left ventricle. On the left side of the heart, this is where you're going to find oxygenated blood, oxygen rich blood. In addition to that, branching out the heart and coming back to the heart, we are starting to look at different types of blood vessels. Arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Usually, when you take a look at arteries in textbooks and drawing, you'll see that it's red because it's containing oxygen rich blood from the hemoglobin content. But keep in mind that not all arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. All arteries, though, are carrying blood away from the heart. So think of the word artery, it starts with the letter A. The word away also starts with the letter A. Just keep in mind, arteries carries blood away from the heart. The majority of the time, most arteries in your body carry oxygenated blood, but there are some exceptions, which we'll talk about later. Veins are vessels that are usually blue. They are carrying blood back to the heart. Because of that, they are usually deoxygenated blood, so oxygen poor blood, because they have to carry that blood back to the heart to get oxygenated. But remember, there there are some exceptions. There are exceptions to this. There is a vein that is actually carrying oxygen rich blood. But the main thing to know is that arteries, they carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back towards the heart. All right, so that is a quick intro to the four chambers of the heart and the blood vessels. Now, what I would like to do is go over blood circulation in the adult. So we are going to look at specific structures of the heart in more detail. And it's very important that you understand how blood circulation works in the adult before you move on to see how blood flows in the fetus. All right, so blood has to return back to the heart to get oxygenated. Remember, as blood is traveling throughout your body, it's going to deposit oxygen to various cells, and that now there is oxygen poor blood. So it's coming back to the heart. Blood from the upper part of the body returns back to the heart via the superior vena cava, and blood from the lower part of the body returns back to the heart via the inferior vena cava. These are also known as pre and post cava. So essentially, both of these vessels, they are carrying oxygen poor blood. They are going to drain the oxygen poor blood into the right atrium. Right atrium pushes the blood through a tricuspid valve into the right ventricles. This is the right ventricle. It contracts, it sends that blood through the pulmonary valve right here into the pulmonary artery. Now remember, at this point, blood is still deoxygenated because it hasn't reached the lungs yet. The pulmonary artery is the exception to the rules that we mentioned earlier. It's a type of artery that is carrying deoxygenated blood. But at the same time, the reason why it's still called an artery is because it's going away from the heart. So it's carrying the blood away from the heart to the lungs where gas exchange occurs, carbon dioxide gets excreted, and then oxygen comes in. And that pulmonary artery carries that oxygen rich blood back into the heart. Well, actually, sorry, the pulmonary artery is then going to send that oxygen poor blood to the lungs, gas exchange occurs, and then it's the pulmonary veins that are then going to carry that oxygen rich blood back to the heart. And then remember, you have the left and the right lungs, so there are the pulmonary arteries and veins on the right and the left side. So the pulmonary veins, you have a pair right here. Now it's a vein, but it's carrying oxygen rich blood, but it's still a vein because it's carrying blood back to the heart. So then the blood lands in the left atrium. It travels through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Left ventricle contracts. It sends the blood through this valve right here called the aortic valve. It's a little bit hidden, but it's right here. And then that sends the blood to the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery in your body, and it's going to branch off, and essentially it's carrying that oxygenated rich blood throughout the rest of the body. So this is how blood flow travels in the adult. All right, so now let's take a look at those structures in even more detail. When you take a look at the thoracic region, the heart is right here. You're going to see a very large vessel. This right here is the superior vena cava. So this is the vessel that's carrying oxygen poor, deoxygenated blood from the upper half of your body back to the heart. On the lower part, and you can even see it going underneath the liver, but on the lower part, and this is the heart right here, you're going to find the inferior vena cava. This is the blood vessel that is carrying deoxygenated blood from the lower part of your body back to your heart. When you open up your heart, you're going to find the right atrium right here. This is actually pointing to the auricle, which is a flap that extends out to increase surface area in your heart. But essentially, you can go ahead and cut open the heart, take a look at the motto even, and you're going to find the right atrium right here. So from the right atrium, it's going to flow through a valve before it reaches the next chamber. So here we're looking at the tricuspid valve. It's a valve that's between the right atrium and the left ventricle. There are 4 valves in the heart, if you remember, and the valves, they function to prevent the backflow of blood. So essentially, when blood from the right atrium flows into the right ventricle, these valves are then going to come up and then close off this area so that blood in the right ventricle doesn't actually go back to the previous chamber. So the function of the tricuspid valve and all the valves in the body that we'll examine, or in the heart, they're going to prevent the backflow of blood. So then, moving into the right ventricle, it receives blood from the right atrium in the adult. When we take a look at the fetus circulation, it's a little bit different, but hold on to that thought. And then from the right ventricle, it's going to pump the blood through the pulmonary valve, which essentially takes it to the pulmonary artery. Now, remember, When you are taking a look at your pig, if you are looking at it in this view, you will see the pulmonary artery right here, and many students confuse this with the aorta. The aorta sits behind the pulmonary artery, as you can see here. So in this image, this is the pulmonary artery. The aorta is in the back. So this right here is the pulmonary artery, also known as the pulmonary trunk. But remember, at this point, the blood is still deoxygenated. It hasn't gone to the lungs yet. It will, though. So the pulmonary arteries, it takes the blood to the lungs. Gas exchange occurs. Now coming back from the lungs, the pulmonary veins are carrying oxygen-rich blood, oxygenated blood. And what you see here is a parapulmonary vein. You can go ahead and remove the heart from the dissection and take a look at this from a bird eye's view. So this is looking at the superior part of the heart. You can see the pulmonary trunk right here. This represents the part of the pulmonary artery that's curved. This is going to send blood to the lungs. And then returning from the lungs, this is the pulmonary vein. So this is the pulmonary vein right here. This is the left side of the heart. This is the right side of the heart. This is the anterior part of the heart. This is the posterior part of the heart. So the pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it's going to drain that blood into the left atrium. The left atrium, remember, it receives that oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. In the fetus, though, this is going to be a little bit different, so keep that in mind. From the left atrium, it's going to flow through another valve called the bicuspid valve. So bi means two. So there are two valves here instead of three, like what we saw in the tricuspid valve. The bicuspid valves are going to open up and allow blood from the left atrium to go into the left ventricle. And once blood is filled in the left ventricle, the valves are going to close to prevent the backflow of blood. The left ventricle is going to then contract and then sends that oxygenated blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, and the aorta is going to send that blood throughout the rest of the body. There are three branches of the aorta, so it's going to send blood into different areas of the body, but this is the aorta right here. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at fetal circulation. In the fetus, since their lungs are filled with fluid, they're not really breathing, they have to rely on the mother for their source of oxygenated blood. And if you remember, when we take a look at the placenta in the previous lab, there's a cross section of the placenta. We can see that there is one umbilical vein and two umbilical arteries. The umbilical vein is the structure that carries that oxygenated rich blood from the placenta and delivers it to the fetus heart. The two umbilical arteries are the ones that are carrying deoxygenated blood from the fetus back to the placenta. And just a preview, we'll see this more in the later lab, but on the lower part of the body, this is the bladder of the fetal pig right here, and then on both sides of the bladder you have the umbilical arteries, and then it's going to drain into the umbilical cord, which is shown here. And again, the umbilical arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood from the fetus to the placenta. Okay, so now that we have understood how blood circulation works in the adult, if we examine how it works in the fetus, there are some major differences. So this is the placenta right here. You can see that the umbilical vein, it's carrying that oxygen-rich blood. Essentially what it's going to do is it's going to shunt into the inferior vena cava. This inferior vena cava, remember, usually in the adult, it's carrying oxygen poor blood. It's carrying deoxygenated blood. But in the fetus, because it's receiving that oxygenated rich blood supply from the placenta, it's actually carrying a mixture of blood. But essentially, that mixture of blood is going to then land in the right atrium, because that's where these inferior vena cava would usually drain that blood. So in the fetus, the right atrium right here is actually carrying a mixture of blood. It's actually carrying blood with high oxygen content. So you think about it, If it's carrying blood with high oxygen content, it doesn't need to go to the lungs, so it can bypass the lungs. One of the ways it does that is between the right atrium and the left atrium in the in the fetal pig, there is an opening called the foramen ovale. So this foramen ovale allows the oxygen-rich blood in the right atrium to flow directly to the left atrium. Okay. From the left atrium, it would then just go through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle and then the out of the heart via the aorta. And remember, the reason why it doesn't have to go to the heart is because there's already high enough oxygen rich blood in the right atrium in the fetus. Now, let's say some of that blood doesn't go through the foramen ovale and it doesn't go into the left atrium. There's another backup mechanism. So, in the fetal heart right here, let's say some of that oxygen rich blood in the right atrium doesn't go through the foramen ovale. Well, the next step that it would go to is the right ventricle. The right ventricle, if you remember, would then take blood to the pulmonary artery. And the pulmonary artery would then leave the heart and carry the blood to the lungs. But remember, in the fetal heart, they already have somewhat high enough oxygen rich blood already because it's coming from the placenta. So at this point, there's actually a mixture of blood. There's oxygenated and deoxygenated, but there's enough oxygen to where it doesn't have to go to the lungs. And remember, the fetus is they're not breathing, so there's not really any oxygen in their lungs. So to prevent the blood from going into the lungs, the pulmonary artery actually connects to the aorta via a bridge called the ductus arteriosus. So this ductus arteriosus bridge allows the blood to bypass the lungs and travel directly to the aorta itself. So what we see too far are two routes. The foramen ovale, which allows blood from the right atrium to move directly to the left atrium, and the ductus arteriosus, which allows blood from the pulmonary artery to move directly to the aorta. Both of these are considered uh, routes that bypass the lungs. And remember, the reason why blood doesn't need to go to the lungs in the fetus is because it's already oxygenated. Okay, and then at birth, the ductus arteriosus they close off, and it becomes a structure called the ligamentum arteriosus. Sometimes you hear a story where a baby is born with a hole in its heart, an open heart. It could be that one of these structures didn't close up properly at birth. Okay, and now taking a step back and looking at the heart in its entire view again. Remember, the heart is a muscle, so it does need its own supply of oxygen rich blood. So the coronary artery right here is an artery that carries oxygen rich blood to the heart. Okay, there's a right coronary artery, a left one, but you can see it right here. And specifically, this coronary artery, it's also used as a division to where you can separate the right versus the left side of the heart. Going back to this again, if you take a look at the top part of the heart, remember this is the pulmonary artery, also known as the trunk in this part. In the back, this is where you actually see the aorta. The aorta, it's going to branch off into three branches. One of the first branches of the aorta is the brachiocephalic artery. The brachiocephalic artery, what you see here, is going to branch off into the right subclavian artery. This is an artery that's going to carry oxygen-rich blood to the upper limbs of the body. And then another branching off of that is the carotid artery, which we'll talk about later. Okay. And then another branch of the aorta is the left subclavian artery. So this is the artery that is going to take blood to the upper limbs of the body, but on the left side. And then you have another branch off the aorta called the left carotid artery, which we'll talk about soon. All right, so moving on to the neck region of the heart, you have the arteries and some veins. If we go back and take a look at the arteries, the carotid arteries, you have the right side and the left side. These arteries are the ones that are carrying oxygen-rich blood to the head, so a very important vessel. And then the jugular veins are going to be the vessels that are carrying oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood from the head back to the heart. With the jugular vein, you have the internal and external jugular vein. Sometimes one of these veins get cut off when you're doing the dissection. So you can just, so jugular veins, if you just write jugular veins, it would be accepted as well. You don't need to differentiate between internal or external jugular veins. So that was the upper part of the body. Now, moving on to the lower part of the body, you don't have to dissect this part out. But essentially, if you were to, you can see that there's a very long artery called the femoral artery. This is the one that is going to deliver oxygenated blood to the lower part of your body. It's a very long artery. And then at the same time, you have the great saphenous vein. This is the vein that's going to carry blood from like your feet and your toes. It's going to drain into the inferior vena cava, and that's going to take that oxygen poor blood back to your heart. So these are some other veins and arteries of interest. Okay. All right, that is the circulatory system. If you're still confused with the blood flow, etc., here is a blank diagram and you can walk through this by yourself. Okay, and I will see you in lab for the dissection.